Hello and welcome to my review for The Threads of Magic by Alison Croggon. This is a middle grade high fantasy novel about a young pickpocket named Pip who lives in the fantastical city of Chlorel. One day, as he is off doing his usual pickpocketing in order to provide dinner for him and his orphan sister, Pip accidentally steals a magical artifact that he refers to as the heart that looks like a still beating heart that has been removed from a body. He doesn't know what it is, but all of a sudden there are assassins that are after him, his life is in danger, and he goes on a journey to discover what the heart is, what it means for him, and how it changes both his life and the overall regime in Chlorel. At the same time, the princess of Chlorel is betrothed to a man from another country who she immediately just gets a bad magical vibe from, decides he's evil, and she wants to run away from the palace. And despite the fact that magic is a real thing in this world and there are plenty of people who practice magic, witchcraft is expressly forbidden, and there's an Office of Witchcraft Affairs that will arrest witches and execute them if they find any. So that is essentially the overall plot of this book, but there's a lot more going on and it has a lot more depth than that. I gave this 3 stars. And I do want to start this review by saying, like, this is a 3-star book for me, but it was a really enjoyable 3-star book. Like, it's a lovely story with some wonderful characters, and it's just charming and nice and lovely, and it's not something that I adored, and it's not something that I fell in love with as much as I would have wanted to, but it was a really nice story, and it was one of those 3 stars that I would recommend if it was your kind of thing, and especially if you're an adult who likes to read middle grade fantasy novels. I think you would get a lot more out of this. To start with the positives, I do like Alison Croggon a lot. She wrote the Pellinor series, which is my favorite fantasy series of all time, probably. I don't read tons of fantasy, but it's a YA fantasy series that I fell in love with as a teenager, and I reread it every so often, and it's one of those series that holds up beautifully. So I had kind of high expectations for this book, and while I was a little bit disappointed, it is a nice book, and you can see her writing style in this that comes from the Pellinor books. Like, it didn't make me fall in love with it, but it was so enjoyable and so nice and lovely and charming, and just like, I have a lot of positive adjectives but not a whole lot of like amazing things to say. I did really like the world and like the overall premise of the story. I thought it was really cool that she set it in this world of magic where magic is banned and all of these witches kind of operate underground and kind of have their own underground power structure. And you see that revealed throughout the book as the main character, Pip, kind of like falls into this world of magic and learns a lot of things that he was previously ignorant of. And it's a really fun story and a really fun learning process to just like go through it with him. I also really like the Princess Georgette. She is very headstrong, very like kind of stereotypical in some ways for princesses in feminist fantasy novels, but in a lot of ways it also subverts a lot of like typical fantasy tropes in a really like fun way, and it was so enjoyable to read about her. And then there's a whole other like cast of characters and a lot of bad things happening kind of in the background that you get a little bit of a glimpse into, but the main story focus is on Pip and his heart and kind of the journey that takes their entire world on. So to get into some of the negatives, because so far like I've had very nice things to say, I do think that while I enjoyed all of the elements of this book, I don't really think the book added up to a whole lot more than that. Like, I really enjoyed each individual element, but it didn't add up to a wonderful story to me. It felt like pretty much everything was super cool but lacked the time and development that it needed. Like, as much as I liked Princess Georgie and her subplot and the subversion of all the princess tropes, I felt like I never got enough of it to really connect with her storyline, to connect with her as a character. Like, I enjoyed it, I liked where it went, I liked her, but I couldn't connect with it because there was just not enough development there. And I felt that way about most aspects of the story. Like, the magic system was really cool, and there was a brief explanation of it. Like, whenever they started like explaining things about the magic, it was really, really interesting. Like, they talked about how it was basically tearing the fabric of reality and then like restitching it together in the way that you wanted, and that's what magic was in this world, which is a really cool concept. But then when it came to the actual like practice of magic, there was really nothing explained. Like, there was nothing of the magic theory worked into it. They would just say, oh, like, she put a sleeping spell on the whole castle. Like, she used a persuasion spell to talk people into, like, agreeing with her. And it's like, there was so much coolness that could have happened and was really just kind of, like, too underdeveloped to really be an interesting part of the story. But it was just, like, so close. Like, I could tell Alison Croggon had thought about it and had all these ideas, but just didn't have the time in this, like, kind of short 350-page middle grade novel. And I also feel like some things I may have been, like, less harsh on than I would have been in another book because of the Books of Pellinor and because I have read them. In some ways, I felt like I was filling in some of the gaps here with the magic system from that book. Like, she would half explain something in this book and I'll be like, oh, well, I have other answers from the Pellinor book, so I'm just gonna fill that in. Because there were a few similarities in the magic system, so I found myself doing that quite a bit, and I think if I hadn't read the Books of Pellinor, I may have had, like, a lot more questions and just enjoyed it less overall, and I don't feel like I should have been doing that at all, because this book isn't connected to that series. This is a standalone. But it was just like, the magic system was like, had so much potential, but just kind of lacked everything. And I also felt that things are just like underexplained. Like, there are assassins in this book. They're just a thing that exists in this world. And for the first like 2/3 of this book, I was thinking of the assassins as just like assassins, as like they would be like this underground, like, oh, they might get orders to just like go kill someone, like stick to the shadows, whatever. And they kept talking about like the assassin like uniform, and I really didn't understand what that was for a very long time. I was so confused. And then it turned out that like assassins did like murder people and get assignments to kill people, but they also functioned as guards. So it was a little bit like weird to discover that 2/3 of the way through the book, because it would have explained so much and I would have spent so much less time confused about it. And not just specifically about the assassins, but that was kind of how I felt with everything in the book, that it just did not get explained well enough. And I spent so much time confused and looking for answers that really should have been given earlier on, because it was things that really weren't part of like the main story or the mystery or the journey the characters went on. It was just basic facts about the world. And while I did love the characters and I loved so many aspects of their being, I never felt emotionally connected the way I would want to, because some very sad things happened in this book. Like, genuinely, like, sad, tugging on your heartstrings. Like, you're having an emotional time because, like, people are dying. Like, it's a fantasy world. Things happen. But I never felt like I was sad enough. Like, I was reading this and something sad would happen and I would be like, oh, that is a very sad event. But I wasn't feeling that sadness. I wasn't feeling emotional. And I want to get like worked up and emotional when very sad things are happening. And it also felt like the characters weren't that emotional. And I do get that this is middle grade. Like, you're not going to have like lots of gore and tragedy going on, because it is like a charming middle grade novel. Like, that is the point. But when you have sad things that are occurring, they need to actually feel sad and they need to be treated as sad by the characters. But it felt like even when they should have been traumatized, the characters were kind of like pretty much okay with things and going along with a lot more than they should have. It all just felt kind of muted. And I think that also had to do with how quickly some things got resolved in this book. Like, a problem would occur. Sometimes a like traumatically large, terrible thing would happen. And the characters would sit there saying, oh no, like, I don't know what to do. And then within like a page or two, they would have a plan, they would be implementing the plan, and then things would be okay again. And it was like a couple of pages, you know? It wasn't very long, and this happened a number of times, and it just felt like resolutions came too quickly. If you want the stakes to be high, if you want the negative things to matter, then the characters really need to work towards their solutions. They need to like earn that positive payoff. It can't just happen in a couple of pages, and sometimes in very confusing and or convenient ways. I wasn't a huge fan of that. And then my last overall point is just that I'm a bit confused about the audience for this book. Like, it is a middle grade book and it's really like charming and lovely, and story-wise it's a very middle grade book, and the characters are very middle grade, which I love. Like, they are kids in this world. Pip is 13, the other characters are like 14 and 15. And they all feel very, very young. Like, even in this fantasy world where bad things have happened, they've been orphaned, Pip is in charge of like providing food for himself and his sister and supporting them. But even with all this responsibility on their shoulders, they do still feel like children. They have that immaturity. They have that like lovely childlike quality because they are children. It wasn't just, I really enjoy that this book didn't like age them up into maturity and responsibility like miniature adults. I love when middle grade actually remembers to treat their children like children. So I did enjoy that from like a middle grade aspect, but it felt like so much of this book was kind of mature for like a middle grade audience. Like the language itself felt very mature for children. And I don't mean like profanity or anything like that. I just mean like the vocabulary and the sentence structure. Like I'm genuinely not sure that I could have read this very easily as a 10-year-old. I think it would have been kind of difficult for me, to be honest. Like an advanced kid, sure, but I don't know, but it just seems like a little bit much for kids. Like it's not super difficult to understand, but as I was reading it, I was noticing that like I wouldn't have been able to follow along with this when I was that age, and I don't know how that works in like a middle grade book if you write it with language like that. Like kids aren't dumb, like you should never write down to children, but there is a type of writing style that just doesn't really work for that. I think when I was 10, I would have been very bored and confused by this. And then the plot at times was also kind of complex with a lot of moving pieces, like to the extent that there were a few times that I was confused and having trouble like following everything that was going on, like the random character perspectives that we got. Sometimes you would just cut to a character because they saw something that no one else did, and this was just a random person, or like you'd cut to the bad guys and like get so much weird new information from them that it was a little bit hard to follow. And again, I think I would have been bored and confused as a 10-year-old. So I don't know that this is really like something that I would recommend to kids, but it's such a lovely story. Like it has that very middle grade vibe. I feel like the ideal audience is maybe like adults who read middle grade fantasy. Like that is the number one group of people that I would recommend this for, because the story is really lovely, the characters are charming, everything is lovely. It just seems a little bit too difficult for kids that age. And I mean, maybe not all kids, maybe just me. Like I know when I was 10, I would have had the hardest time with this. So maybe I'm just speaking from a personal perspective, and maybe other kids would be fine, but I personally would have struggled a lot. But overall, this was lovely. It was nice. Like this was a very like nice book. I had a good time reading it, but I didn't connect emotionally, and it just needed a lot more time and development. And it felt like Alison Croggon knew what she was writing, and she had the idea of how everything worked in this world and the magic system and the characters in her head, but because it was a standalone middle grade novel, she just got too limited by the story itself and couldn't share everything with the reader, which was kind of disappointing because I do feel like this book had so much potential and just could never fully realize it. But I would recommend this if you like reading middle grade fantasy. It's charming and lovely, and I had a good time even if this wasn't going to be a favorite for me. Let me know down below if you've read The Threads of Magic and what you thought of it if you have. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.